As we mentioned, we are keeping an eye on the very latest with the ongoing government shutdown, the longest now in U.S. history at 36 days. And at last check, there were lawmakers in negotiations right now, an attempt to try to end this, but it's yet to be seen how successful they'll be, and if so, over what timeline that deal could take. We are chatting right now with political science professor from North Carolina State University, Steven Greene. Thank you so much for joining us, Steven. We appreciate your time.
You bet. Good to be with you.
Yeah, good to see you again. So I guess we'll start off, obviously, with the big headline, the fact this is now historic in nature as far as this shutdown is concerned, 36 days. What do you think folks are feeling at this point? I mean, we talked about, in prior segments, how this is something that is kind of, recent in the sense that we see these shutdowns more and more. We're now at 36 days. I mean, how big of a deal is this?
Well, the issue is that for some people, it's a really big deal, right? If you are a government employee, this is a really big deal. Probably mentioned before, I have family in Northern Virginia where a huge portion of the people are employed by the government or directly impacted by that employment. And that's a really big deal. If you work for the TSA and you are working without necessarily being paid, that's a really big deal. But the truth is, I'll be honest, for me and for my life, being a professor here at NC State University, I suspect most people just working at WCNC, you're able to go about your life with pretty minimal disruption or negative impact from the shutdown. And as long as the costs of the shutdown are concentrated in that pretty small group, and most of us can be like, yeah, things are fine, or, well, I had a friend who had this big delay at the airport, then there's not a lot of incentive for people to really get angry and start pushing our politicians to say, hey, we've got to do something about this. And again, there are people saying that, but most of us are not that directly affected. And again, and I think one of the effects of us having so many of these shutdowns in recent years is that they have come up with ways to try and diminish that direct impact on a lot of voters.
You talked about the impacts and how for some it is monumental. I mean, we have people who are going without paychecks at this point and trying to figure out where money is going to come from. And, it gets me kind of curious about the timeline of this, because we know when we were talking about this at the very, very beginning, we knew that there was kind of a runway of about 2 weeks where there would be the paycheck that the person was living on last, the last paycheck that they got. And then after 2 weeks, would be the point at which they're going forward now without any pay. So here we are at 36 days. Are we expecting any sort of compiling impacts either to these folks who are directly impacted or to the American people? How sustainable is this at this point to continue on day after day? Are there going to be different layers or levels to this as we continue on if we do?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, different parts of the government are operating on different timelines. And we just saw most recently the SNAP benefits, that is the food stamp assistance to many Americans, look like they were going to be cut, but now there's a court fight and they will be getting those, I think. But different effects kick in at different times. You've got a transportation workforce when you look at things like air traffic controllers, which are stretched thin and increasingly stretched thin. And at some point, does that reach a breaking point? Probably. So the truth is, yeah, there is this cumulative effect, and more things will go wrong, more things will get worse. I think the good news is that the elections last night seemed to be a real kick in the pants, and certainly President Trump has talked about trying to resolve this quickly. From what I've read today, it sounds like congressional leaders in both parties are looking to come towards some sorts of resolution where they can get the government back open. And obviously that would be great if they can reach some kind of deal that both sides feel like they are comfortable with.
Now, my next question is admittedly kind of a niche question, but it is a question we received nonetheless. Folks want to know why lawmakers are getting paid right now when other people who are working are not.
Because they've written the law that way. I mean, you can, because we've had so many shutdowns, they have specific laws governing how all of this is going to happen during a shutdown. And I don't know the backstory of that, but yeah, that's just part of it. And again, some people are getting paid. Some people are working without getting paid. Some people are not working and will get back pay. I mean, there's just all kinds of permutations to this, honestly, that, looked at from the 20,000-foot view are probably not fair. But, it's certainly not fair that a fairly small group of Americans is bearing the brunt of the impact from this.
So it sounds like essentially there are different pots of money, if you will, or different,
Yeah.
spending buckets, and lawmakers happen to be in a different one. It's just, it's interesting. And like I mentioned, it was a question that we got. So appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, and let's be honest, lawmakers insulate themselves in certain ways. And, people have talked about for years about limiting their ability to trade, to make certain kind of stock trades and other ways in which they can enrich themselves. But I want to say on some level, the voters don't care enough about these issues to actually vote anybody out of office for it. And until that happens, if somebody were going to be voted out of office by their opponent saying, look, this person took their salary during the government shutdown while all these other hardworking Americans couldn't, and that would actually cost them a large number of votes, well, then we'd get change. But the truth is, when you've got, I don't know, probably over 90% of Americans simply voting for the R or the D next to the name, and you say, well, I don't love that this guy did it, but he's my Democrat, or I don't love that this representative did this, but she's the Republican representing me, we're not going to get that kind of change.
So, I mean, I guess to go back and really maybe just jump off of your last point, but go back to what you mentioned about the kick in the pants. Obviously we had election night. It seemed to be a successful night for Democrats on various levels of government. And I'm just curious how much of a role the shutdown might have played in that, in your opinion. And
I mean,
yeah.
It almost surely did in Virginia, again, which is so dependent on government workers, and the winning candidate there, Abigail Spanberger, had a very large margin, which almost surely was certainly partly based on the shutdown. But, Democrats had a very good night in New Jersey, which is less related. They had a good night in all sorts of places. And, I think the shutdown may have played some small part of that, but I expect it's more just dissatisfaction with President Trump generally. And the shutdown is probably, I think, just one part of that. So
where do you think we go from here at this point? As you mentioned, there are negotiations that are happening, presumably as we speak. I haven't seen any updates saying that they've come out of the room and they've got an update for us. But, do you think that there is an agreement that's imminent based on what you're deducing by watching the headlines or seeing how leaders are addressing the situation or their tone today?
I feel like, again, like, my problem is I'm always an optimist. But I feel like there is. I feel like having this election happen gives both sides an excuse to say, well, the ground has changed and we need to have an agreement now. And even if the Democrats are giving in, shall we say, on some degree, and I think they'll need to, because that's what a negotiation is. Both sides have to give in. It will be in the context of, look, hey, we won big in the election, and we really just need to get this done now while we have the upper hand after that. And Republicans can say, look, we lost the election, things changed, so we now have to really negotiate harder and find some sort of agreement. And again, I think whatever deal is made, both sides will be able to say, hey, here are things we got that we wanted. We did not totally lose. You can't have a deal where one side is just like, yeah, we quit, the other side just beat us. And I think having this election kind of, shakes up the board enough, if you will, that both sides can hopefully come to some agreement where they say, well, we lost some stuff, but here's what we got. And hopefully the election will be a catalyst for that.
I've said this before, but I fully believe it. I think we can all be students of political science and learn more about how our country works and how, local government works and state government. Pretend we're all your students. What lessons do you want us to take away from this experience? What do you want us to know or learn more about after having gone through this?
Oh man, that's a tough one. Because I would say, part of me wants to say, well, government matters, but again, so much of it is that they have sheltered most Americans from the actual suffering. That it is a pretty small minority of Americans who are really bearing the costs of this. And honestly, one of the things I always talk to my students about is that. When you have a small group that's suffering and everybody else is benefiting, the politics of this are tough because we're all, not all, but most of us are able to carry on. So, when shutdowns have ended in the past, it's because the pain has been more widely spread. And, if we want this to end in some level, and then I think it will, but if more people were feeling the pain, and in some of the previous shutdowns, you did have wider pain, then that led to quicker endings of them.
So essentially understand the consequences of,
Yeah. Yeah.
actions on the government level. All right. Professor Steven Greene, thank you so much for your time. Great to see you again.
Great to see you. Thanks.